Wide on a town in eastern Iowa at dusk. A water tower, a row of brick storefronts, a single road climbing east out of the houses lined with old elms, ending at a hill. On the crown of that hill, against the last red light of October, a five-story mansion. White wood, twin copper towers gone the color of the sea. A glass dome rising between them, lit from inside by colors that have no name. Closer now. A porch step. A young woman with a bandaged left hand sitting very still. She is 22. She has just driven all night to find her grandparents in a Walmart parking lot. She has just bid $12 on a house at a tax auction, while a room full of strangers laughed. Closer still. Her eyes. Something in her face that has not been there in 6 months. Then, 3 miles down the hill, a black sedan turning onto Cresswell Hill Road, headlights cutting through the dusk. When Tamsin Vance raised her hand at the Linden County tax auction with $342 in her wallet and a bandaged left hand pressed flat against her chest, the room went quiet. Not slowly, all at once, like someone had closed a door behind her. She was 22. She wore a gray hooded sweatshirt that used to belong to her mother. Her hair was the color of wheat that had been left too long in the sun. The auctioneer looked at her over the rims of her glasses and said the words again, just to be sure. $12. Yes, ma'am. For the house. Yes, ma'am. A man in the third row laughed once, then stopped. His wife elbowed him in the ribs. Tamsin's grandfather stood beside her. Eldridge Bostwick was 74 years old, a retired structural engineer, and he was holding her right hand the way you hold a child's hand when you cross the street together. Her grandmother stood on his other side. Wilhelmina Bostwick was 71 and had not slept in a real bed for 9 nights. Both of them were watching her sign the papers. The auctioneer slid a single brass key across the table. "Good luck," she said. She did not sound like she meant it, but this is not the part of the story where it starts. It started 2 weeks earlier in a practice room on the 4th floor of the Cincinnati Conservatory, where Tamsin was trying to play a Schumann piece with a hand that did not entirely belong to her anymore. The thumb still worked. That was the thing she kept telling herself. The thumb and the second finger still moved the way they were supposed to move, and the wrist still rotated, and if she sat very still and concentrated on the architecture of the chord rather than the speed of it, she could land on the keys without her fourth finger collapsing under her. 6 months ago, she had been on her way to a sophomore recital. Her mother was driving. Her father was in the passenger seat reading from a folded program. The road was wet. The truck that crossed the median came from somewhere none of them saw. Her parents died at the scene. Tamsin was in a medically induced coma for 9 days. When she woke up, her left hand was wrapped in white gauze, and there was a man in a white coat at the foot of the bed explaining the words ulnar neuropathy and radial nerve damage, as if she were a child being taught the names of new colors. She lost the ring finger first, then the pinky, then half the sensation in the palm. The conservatory had been kind. They held her place. Her professor, Dr. Matilda Rourke, had pulled out a folder of research papers and laid them on the desk between them, and said very gently that there was a small body of work being developed for pianists with limited mobility, and that Tamsin might still have a career, but it would not be the one she had imagined. Tamsin had thanked her. She had carried the folder home. She had spent the next 6 months teaching her thumb to do things thumbs were not supposed to do. She was in that practice room when her phone vibrated. She let it go to voicemail. Then it vibrated again. Then a third time. She lifted her hands from the keys and looked at the screen. Grandma Willa, 3 calls in 11 minutes. She answered. The sound on the other end was wind, then a sniff, then her grandmother's voice very thin. "Sweetheart, I'm sorry to call you in the middle of your day." "Grandma, where are you?" A pause. "I'm in the parking lot of a Walmart." "Which Walmart?" "I don't know." Tamsin sat down on the bench. She did not remember sitting down. She just found herself sitting. "Where's Grandpa?" He's in the car. Whose car? Ours. Grandma, listen to me. Where are you? Her grandmother started crying then. Tamsin had heard her grandmother cry exactly once in her entire life, and that was at her mother's funeral, and the sound was the same now as it had been then. A small, dry, breaking sound, like a piece of paper being folded too many times. Maxwell put a sign on the house, her grandmother said. He sold it. He sold the house, Tamsin, everything. The piano, the wedding china, your mother's books. He gave us 45 minutes to pack 2 bags. Tamsin stood up. The Schumann piece was still open on the music stand. She did not see it. Where are you? She said again. Tell me a landmark. Tell me a road sign. Anything. There's a billboard for a steakhouse. What town? I don't know what town. What state? A long silence. I don't know, sweetheart. Tamsin packed in 17 minutes. She left the Schumann piece on the music stand. She left her toothbrush in the bathroom. She took the folder of research papers from Dr. Rourke in a sweatshirt, in her wallet, in her keys, and she drove out of Cincinnati at 4 in the afternoon with the sun behind her and her phone on the passenger seat. She drove home. Home was the house in suburban Illinois where she had grown up, where her parents had raised her, where her grandparents had moved in after her father's stroke 12 years ago to help take care of him, where her mother had taught Tamsin to play Clair de Lune by ear at 6 years old, sitting on the bench beside her hands stacked over her hands, where the doorframe in the kitchen still had pencil marks tracking her height from age 4 to age 15, after which she had decided she was done growing and stopped letting them measure her. She pulled into the driveway at 9:40 at night. There was a sign on the lawn, sold, closed. Congratulations to the new owners. The lights were on inside. A family she did not recognize was eating dinner at the kitchen table. A little boy in pajamas was kneeling on her mother's piano bench. Tamsin sat in the driveway with her hands on the wheel. She did not cry. She had not cried since the funeral. There was a place inside her where crying used to come from, and that place had been cauterized closed by the same surgery that took the feeling out of her left hand. She backed out of the driveway. She drove to the realtor's office on Beach Avenue. The lights were off, but there was an after-hours emergency number printed on the window. She called it. A woman named Pamela answered. Tamsin explained who she was. There was a long silence on the other end. Honey, Pamela said, I think you need to come in tomorrow morning. I need to know now. Who sold that house? Another silence. Your Uncle Maxwell. On whose authority? On yours? Tamsin stood very still in the parking lot of the realtor's office. What? He brought in a notarized power of attorney signed by you, dated last March while you were in the hospital. He had medical authority and financial authority both. He came in 3 months ago and listed the house. We closed last Tuesday. I never signed a financial power of attorney. Honey, I have it in my files. I can show you tomorrow. Tamsin hung up. She stood in the parking lot for a long time. The night was cold for October. The wind moved through the dry leaves of a maple tree above her head, and the sound it made was the sound of someone whispering in another room. She remembered signing one piece of paper at the hospital. One. It had been 3 days after she woke up from the coma, and Maxwell had brought it in with a kind smile and a clipboard. Limited medical authority, he had said. Just so we can authorize your physical therapy. Just so the doctors have someone to call if something comes up while you're sleeping. She had signed it without reading it. She was on morphine. Her hand was bandaged. Her parents had been dead for 2 weeks. She remembered. He had stood beside the bed and watched her sign it, and when she was done, he had taken the clipboard and put a clean copy of a different paper underneath it and said very quietly, "And one more, sweetheart, just for the medical bills." She had signed that one too. She got back in the car. She did not start the engine for a long time. When she finally drove, she did not know where she was driving. The phone on the seat beside her had her grandmother's last call still open with the message at the bottom that said, "Location not available." She drove east. She drove east because Maxwell lived west in the suburbs of Chicago, and she could not bear the thought of being closer to him than she had to be. She drove east because the road out of town went east. She drove east because her grandmother had said there was a billboard for a steakhouse, and there were 1,000 steakhouses east of her between Illinois and Iowa. She stopped at every gas station that had an attendant. She asked if anyone had seen an older couple in a blue Buick, a man in his 70s, a woman with white hair, maybe stop for coffee, maybe use the restroom. At a Sunoco outside Galesburg, a man behind the counter said yes. Yes, he remembered them. They had bought a thermos of coffee and a bag of pretzels, and the man had told him his GPS was broken and asked the way to a town called Marbury. Marbury. Tamsin had never heard of it. She typed it into her phone. A small dot in eastern Iowa appeared. Population 1,500, 2.5 hours away. She drove. She arrived in Marbury at 3:12 in the morning. The town was dark. Main Street had a hardware store, a feed supply, a post office with a flag drooping from a pole, and a diner with a sign that said, "Loretta's open 6 to 8 every day but Christmas." The lights inside the diner were off. A blue Buick was parked in front of it, with two figures slumped sideways in the front seats asleep. Tamsin stopped her car behind the Buick. She walked up to the passenger window. Her grandmother was curled against the door. Her grandfather was in the driver's seat with his head tipped back and his mouth slightly open, breathing the careful, slow breaths of an old man who was trying not to disturb his wife. There were two suitcases in the back seat. There was a grocery bag with a thermos and what looked like a half-eaten pretzel sticking out of it. Tamsin tapped the glass. Her grandfather opened his eyes. He saw her. He did not look surprised. He looked the way her grandfather looked when he had been waiting for a long time, and the thing he was waiting for had finally arrived. He rolled down the window. "You found us," he said. "Grandpa, wake your grandmother. Slowly. She's been having a hard time." Tamsin tapped on the window on the other side of the car. Wilhelmina opened her eyes. She did not sit up at first. She looked at Tamsin through the glass like a person looking at something she did not believe was real. And then her face crumpled, and she pressed both palms flat against the window, and Tamsin pressed her own palm against the other side, and they stayed like that for a long time. Loretta Bissay opened the diner at 6 o'clock on the dot, because that was when she opened the diner every day of her life. And on this particular morning, she found three people sitting in a car outside her restaurant with the windows fogged and a young woman crying in the back seat. Loretta was 60 years old. She had run the diner for 31 years. She was divorced. She had reading glasses on a chain around her neck and a coffee pot in each hand by force of habit. And she had spent her entire adult life learning to recognize the look of people who had been driving for a long time. She walked over to the car. She tapped on the driver's side window. "Y'all coming in or sleeping out here?" she said. "Because I'd prefer you came in. I just made the muffins." She brought them coffee and 3 plates of eggs without asking. She brought blueberry muffins and a small plate of butter and a wedge of cheese she said had been a gift from a neighbor with a dairy farm. When Eldridge reached for his wallet, she shook her head once. "First-timers eat free," she said. "Is that a real policy?" "It is now." She let them eat. She did not ask questions. She refilled the coffee and stood behind the counter, wiping the same spot on the counter for 10 minutes longer than the spot required. When Tamsin finally pushed her plate away and let out a long breath that was not quite a sob, but was not quite, not one either, Loretta walked over and sat down across from her and put both hands flat on the table. "Honey," she said, "you want to tell me what's going on, or you want to just sit here a while longer?" So Tamsin told her. She told her about the hospital, about the signature, about the phone call from the parking lot, about driving east at 4 in the afternoon. She told her about the realtor and the notarized form and her parents' grave in a cemetery in Illinois that nobody had visited in 3 months because there was nobody left to visit it. Loretta listened. She did not interrupt. When Tamsin was done, Loretta got up and walked behind the counter and came back with a small brown paper flyer. She set it on the table. It said Linden County Tax Auction, Saturday morning, 10 o'clock, 13 properties. At the bottom of the list was an address, 14 Cresswell Hill Road. The property description took up 3 lines. Steamboat Gothic Mansion, circa 1885. Approximately 7,000 square feet, 5 stories plus twin octagonal towers, and a stained glass cupola condemned by the county. In 1989, no utility structural assessment, unknown. Minimum bid $12. That's the old Cresswell place, Loretta said. Kids round here call it the wedding cake. Been empty since old Theodora died 63 years ago. $12, Tamsin said. $12. Eldridge picked up the flyer. He read the description twice. He set it back down on the table and looked at his wife. Willa looked back at him. They had been married for 49 years. They could have a complete conversation in 1 second and 4 blinks. It's haunted, Loretta said. Or so people say. Personally, I think every old house makes noise and people hear what they want to hear. But that's the reason it's never been bought. Nobody around here wants the headache. Tamsin picked up the flyer. She looked at the address. You said Cresswell, she said. That's right, Theodora Cresswell. She was a piano teacher before her time. Her father founded the old Marbury Conservatory of Music back in 1882. First of its kind west of the Mississippi, my mother used to say. Whole town was built up around it before the railroad bypassed us in 1912. Theodora was the last of the line. Eldridge looked up. Conservatory of Music, he said. Mm-hmm. In Marbury. Mm-hmm. The buildings are gone now, burned in 26, but the Cresswell stayed on in the mansion. Tamsin sat very still. 6 months ago, her professor at the Cincinnati Conservatory had pulled out that folder of research papers and laid it on the desk between them. And one of those papers had been a brief article in a music history journal about a regional Midwestern conservatory that had pioneered chamber music education for women in the late 19th century. The article had named 4 institutions. One of them had been the Marbury Conservatory. Tamsin had read that article 3 times. She had circled the name. She looked up at her grandfather. Grandpa. I know. That's the same Marbury. I know. Wilhelmina was looking at the two of them with the alert expression she used when she sensed something passing between people that she did not yet have the context to understand. Loretta refilled all 3 coffees. You folks want to go look at it, she said. Yes, Tamsin said. It's a wreck. Yes. You drove all night. Yes. Loretta smiled. The smile changed her whole face. She tore the flyer off the bulletin board behind the counter and folded it twice and handed it to Tamsin. Auction Saturday at 10. That's the day after tomorrow. The mansion's at the end of Cresswell Hill Road, 3 miles east of here. You can't miss it. If you stand on the courthouse steps and look east, you can see the cupola from town. The auction was held in the basement of the Linden County Courthouse. There were 30 folding chairs set up in 3 rows. There were 11 people sitting in the chairs. Most of them were men in work jackets with Seed Company logos on the chests. One of them was a woman in her 40s wearing a windbreaker over hospital scrubs. Tamsin sat in the back row between her grandparents. She held the flyer in her right hand. She kept her left hand in her lap. The auctioneer was the same woman who had been there last year and the year before. Her name was Dorothy. She had been doing this job for 19 years, and she had a clipboard, and she read the property descriptions in a flat, polite voice that did not editorialize. The first 3 lots went fast, vacant land, all of them. A half acre near the creek went to a young couple for $45. A back lot near the school went to a man in a Caterpillar cap for $60. A pair of unbuildable strips near the railroad bridge went together for $18 to nobody in particular. Dorothy turned the page. Lot 8, 14 Cresswell Hill Road, Steamboat Gothic residence, approximately 7,000 square feet, 5 stories, plus twin octagonal towers, and a central glass cupola. Condemned by the county in 1989. No water, no electric, no gas. Foundation status unknown. Roof status unknown. Starting bid is $12. The room shifted. Two men in the front row looked at each other and grinned. One of them made a small sound that was almost a laugh. Dorothy waited. She held her pen against the clipboard. Do I have $12? Silence. She lifted the pen. Tamsin raised her hand. The room went quiet. Not gradually, all at once, as if someone in the back had thrown a switch. Dorothy looked at her over the top of her glasses. Miss, you understand this property is condemned. Yes, ma'am. There are no utilities. The county makes no guarantee of safety. To reconnect services, you would need a structural certification from a licensed engineer. Eldridge cleared his throat. I am one, he said. Retired. I can certify it. Dorothy looked at him. She looked at the young woman beside him with the bandaged hand. She looked back down at her clipboard. $12 to the lady in the back row, she said. Nobody bid against her. Nobody even looked at her. There was a soft murmur in the front row, but no one raised a hand. Tamsin walked up to the table. She signed 3 pages. She handed Dorothy $12 in cash, a 10 and 2 ones smoothed flat on the wood of the table. Dorothy handed her a single brass key on a small ring. Good luck, Dorothy said. She did not sound like she meant it. Outside the courthouse, the wind was coming from the west, and it carried the smell of distant rain. Tamsin stood on the top step with the key in her right hand and looked east the way Loretta had told her to. The town spread out below her, a row of low brick storefronts, a water tower with the word Marbury painted on it in faded green, a few church steeples, 2 grain silos at the edge of the corn, and rising above all of it, half a mile away on the crown of a low hill, at the dead end of a single straight road, the Wedding Cake Mansion. She had seen drawings of steamboat Gothic houses in a History of American Architecture book on her grandmother's shelf, but no drawing had prepared her for this. The mansion was enormous. 5 stories of white wood and weathered trim, 3 full porches stacked one atop another, like the tiers of a wedding cake, each one wrapped completely around the building. The lowest porch was 40 feet across. The middle porch was narrower. The top porch was narrower still. Each one was lined with delicate gingerbread fretwork carved in patterns she could not quite make out from this distance. But the wind moved through the trim, and you could see the way the shadows fell through it onto the walls behind. 2 octagonal towers rose from the east and west corners of the mansion, 4 stories tall, each capped with a peaked roof of oxidized copper that had turned the pale, almost luminous blue-green of patina. Even at this distance from half a mile away, the copper roofs caught the morning light and threw it back in a soft, strange color that had no name in any paint store. But it was the cupola that stopped her breath. Rising from the center of the roof between the 2 towers was a glass dome 5 stories tall. 8 tall windows of stained glass set in iron tracery. Even from here she could see the colors, reds and golds and dark greens. Each window was set with a panel of inlaid lead in the shape of a different musical instrument. She could just barely make out the curve of a harp on the south face, a violin on the east, a piano on the west. The sun was behind clouds, but the wind shifted, and for 2 seconds the clouds opened, and the light came down on the cupola, and the whole dome lit up like a lantern. Reds and greens and golds threw themselves across the roof and the porches and the lawn. The mansion looked for those 2 seconds as if it had been built to hold a fire. Then the clouds closed again. Wilhelmina was crying silently beside her. Eldridge had taken off his hat. He held it in both hands against his chest. Honey, Wilhelmina said, we just bought that. Yes, Grandma. For $12. Yes. Tamsin, Eldridge said. He said her name the way he had said it when she was 8 years old and had climbed too high in the oak tree in the backyard. Tamsin, look at the cupola. I see it. That's not steamboat Gothic. Not exactly. Whoever built that didn't build a house. They built an instrument. She did not know what he meant, but she nodded. They drove the 3 miles east on Cresswell Hill Road. The road was lined with old elms. The houses along the lower stretch were small, well-kept. Then the houses got farther apart. Then there were no houses. Then the road climbed a low rise, and at the very end, at the place where the pavement gave out and turned to a gravel circle, the mansion sat on the top of its hill. The yard was waist-high in weeds. The porches sagged in three places. One window in the east tower was broken, and a starling had built a nest in the gap. The paint was peeled down to the bare wood in places. Long curling strips of it lay along the foundations. But the bones. Tamsin could see what her grandfather saw. The bones were good. The wraparound porches were level. The towers were plumb. The copper on the roofs was intact. The cupola windows, when she got close enough to see them, were unbroken. All 8 of them. After 63 years. Eldridge walked the perimeter. He laid his hand flat against 3 of the foundation stones. He climbed the front steps, slowly testing each one with his weight. He stood on the porch and put his palm against a column and held it there for a long time. He came back down to where Tamsin was standing. "The cupola is acoustically engineered," he said. "What?" "The angle of the glass, the proportions, the position of the windows. This wasn't designed by an architect, or not only by one. There's a musician's hand in this design. Somebody told the builder exactly how to shape that dome." Tamsin looked up at it. "Grandpa." "What?" "Who builds a 5-story stained glass dome on top of their house?" He smiled. The wind moved through what was left of his hair. "Somebody who wanted the music to go further than the walls would let it," he said. The brass key turned in the front lock after some persuading. The door swung inward on hinges that screamed once and then went quiet. The smell came first. Dust, old wood, dried flowers, something faintly sweet and faintly bitter at the same time, like a room that had been kept closed for so long it had begun to develop its own weather. The foyer was dim. Eldridge forced open a window shutter. Light fell across a hardwood floor buried under 63 years of gray. A staircase rose along the wall, carved oak, the banisters still intact. Straight ahead lay a parlor with a tall bay window. To the right, a dining room with a fireplace of riverstone. A row of ceramic figurines stood on the mantel, so coated in dust their shapes were barely visible. Tamsin walked through slowly. She ran her hand along the staircase rail and left a clean line in the gray. "Somebody loved this house," she said. "Yes," Wilhelmina said. Eldridge was already working. He tapped walls. He listened. He pressed his palm against the joist where the framing met the floor. He went down into the cellar with a flashlight for 15 minutes and came back up with cobwebs in his hair, nearly smiling. "Oak framing all the way through," he said. "Stone foundation. The mortar's gone soft in places, but the stones are square and true. The porch needs rebuilding. The roof has soft spots near the chimneys. But the core structure is the most solid I've seen in 50 years of looking at houses." "And we got it for $12, Wilhelmina said. "We got it for $12. They slept in the parlor that first night. Eldridge had bought sleeping bags from the hardware store on Main Street, where a quiet man named Donovan Tice had looked at the $12 deed and opened a store credit line without being asked. "Pay when you can," Donovan had said. "Come back when you need something. You will." The house made noises after dark. Creaks, pops. A low groaning sound that traveled through the framing when the wind shifted. Tamsin lay on her sleeping bag with her bandaged hand resting on her chest and listened. "It's not ghost," her grandfather said from the dark beside her. "I know. Wood contracts when the temperature drops at night. The exterior cools faster than the interior. The framing redistributes the load." "Grandpa." "What?" "You don't have to explain everything." He was quiet for a moment. "I do, though," he said. "Habit, 42 years of explaining buildings to people. Hard to break." She smiled in the dark. He could not see it, but she suspected he knew it was there. Wilhelmina could not sleep. The floor was hard, her hip ached. The house was still a stranger to her, and she had never been good at sleeping in places that did not know her name yet. Around midnight, she got up. She took the battery lantern Donovan had loaned them, and she walked through the first floor of the mansion. She did not look for anything. She moved through the rooms the way she had walked through a new neighborhood as a young woman when she and Eldridge had first moved to Illinois, and she had needed to learn the shape of the streets by walking them. She ended up in the parlor in the back corner in the dim circle of lantern light. There was a piano bench there. She stopped. It was oak, plain, hinged lid, no piano anywhere near it. But the bench sat alone in the corner, and the floorboards around it were marked with four circular dents where the feet of an instrument had stood for years, maybe decades. She sat down on the bench. Her knuckles were swollen at every joint. She had taught piano for 30 years. Her students had won state competitions. One of them had earned a scholarship to Juilliard the year Eldridge was diagnosed with the heart murmur. Another played second chair with a regional symphony in Oregon now. She had been a good teacher. She had not been a famous one. There was a difference, and she had made her peace with the difference long before the arthritis came. The arthritis had come anyway. She lifted the lid of the bench. Inside was a layer of fine dust, and one folded piece of paper yellowed at the edges, brittle along the creases. She lifted it out carefully with two fingers. It was a single sheet of music manuscript paper, hand-drawn staves in iron gall ink. 8 bars of music, written in a tight, careful hand, the note heads neat, the stems straight. In pencil above the staff, the composer had written fingering numbers, but they were not standard fingerings. The thumb was being asked to do things thumbs did not normally do. The second finger was holding chords the fourth finger should have held. Wilhelmina knew what she was looking at without quite knowing how she knew it. She walked back into the foyer, holding the page flat in both hands. Tamsin, her granddaughter sat up in her sleeping bag. Grandma, come here. Bring the lantern. Tamsin crossed the parlor. She took the page from her grandmother. She held it under the lantern light. Her left hand was bandaged, but she could still hold a piece of paper. She looked at the music. Her face changed slowly. Grandma? Yes. This handwriting. I know. I have seen this handwriting before. In Dr. Rourke's folder 6 months ago in the practice room at the Cincinnati Conservatory, there had been 3 photocopied pages of a manuscript that the music history department had been trying to identify for almost 15 years. They had found the pages in an estate sale in Iowa in 2011, in a box of unmarked papers mixed in with old church bulletins. The composer was unknown. The style was distinctive. The fingerings were unlike anything else in the literature from that period. The department had been calling the composer the Marbury Anonymous because the box had come from an antique store in a small Iowa town, and that was the only clue the box had carried. Tamsin had read those 3 pages until she could see the note heads with her eyes closed. The handwriting on the bench paper was the same handwriting. She looked up at her grandmother. Grandma, this is the Marbury Anonymous. What? This is... Grandma, there has been a department at the Cincinnati Conservatory looking for this composer for 15 years. Dr. Rourke, my professor, she has been looking for this composer. Wilhelmina sat down on the floor beside the lantern. Slowly the way she sat down now, with one hand braced on the floor and the other on her knee. Sweetheart, she said, are you sure? I am sure, Grandma. I am very sure. The next morning, Loretta came up the front walk at 7:30 carrying a wicker basket with a checkered cloth over the top. The basket held 6 blueberry muffins, a thermos of coffee, 2 red apples, and a wedge of cheddar wrapped in wax paper. She found them on the porch. She handed the basket to Eldridge and looked at Tamsin's face and asked her what was wrong. So Tamsin showed her the page. Loretta sat down on the porch step beside her. She held the page very carefully with the tips of her fingers the way a person holds something old. Honey, she said, I am going to tell you a story, and I am going to tell it short because I don't think you have time for the long version. She set the page down between them. Cornelius Cresswell came to Marbury in 1878. He was a logging baron up from Missouri, and he was rich, and he wanted to do something with his money that wasn't logging. So he built a music conservatory. 1882, first of its kind west of the Mississippi. He hired teachers from New York and Boston. He paid them double what they could make back east. He brought instruments out on the train. He built this house in 1885 for his only daughter, Theodora. She was 9 years old at the time. The cupola was his gift to her because she had told him at 6 years old that she could hear God through stained glass. Loretta paused. She looked up at the dome. Theodora grew up to teach piano in this parlor. She married a man named Augustus Cresswell, who took her name because she was the last of the Cresswell line. He died in Korea in '52. She had one daughter, Lavinia, born in 1939. She paused. Lavinia was a genius. People in this town still talk about her, the ones old enough to remember. My mother heard her play once when she was 14. Said it sounded like somebody talking to you from a long way away. Said it changed the shape of the air in the room. She was set to go to the conservatory in Cincinnati. Full scholarship. Her bags were packed. She was 19 years old. Tamsin already knew the way. You know the ending of a story when somebody has been speaking for a certain length of time in a certain tone of voice. She got pneumonia, Loretta said. 4 days. Monday she was at the piano. Friday she was gone. The wind moved through the elms along the road. Theodora sealed the third floor after that. Nailed the door shut. Plastered over it. Lived on the first floor alone for 5 years. Died in '63. No family left. The county took the house for taxes. Auction failed twice. Then it just sat. For 63 years. She looked at Tamsin. You're telling me that paper in your hand is hers? Yes. Lavinia's? Yes. Loretta exhaled slowly through her nose. Then there's more upstairs, she said. Somewhere. She wouldn't have left just one page. Eldridge had not said anything for the whole story. He stood at the porch rail with his back to them, looking up at the cupola, his hand resting flat on the white-painted wood. Now he turned around. Loretta, he said, how many floors did you say? 3 floors of living space plus the cupola. Why? He looked at Tamsin. There are 5 floors. What? From the outside, this is a 5-story house. I walked the perimeter yesterday. I counted the windows. There are 5 rows of them on the east elevation plus the cupola. But inside, we have a foyer level, a second floor with bedrooms, and a third floor with the servants' quarters and the access to the cupola. That's 3 levels, plus a cellar. He paused. There's a floor in this house that doesn't show up from the inside. Tamsin stood up. Where? She said. I don't know yet, but the missing floor would be between what we're calling the 3rd floor and the cupola. There should be a level there. There isn't a staircase to it from the 3rd floor hallway. Whoever built this house designed the access to be hidden, or whoever lived here later made it hidden. Loretta's hand had gone to her mouth. She was looking up at the mansion with the expression of a woman who had lived in a small town for 60 years and was learning just now that the town had been keeping a secret from her the whole time. Tamsin walked into the foyer. Her grandfather followed her. Her grandmother stayed on the porch with Loretta. The 2 older women did not speak. They stood side by side and looked up at the cupola and at the row of windows on the east elevation and at the place where the windows on the 4th floor should have been, but were not. Tamsin climbed the staircase to the 3rd floor. The 3rd floor was short, 2 doors on the right, servants' quarters, empty rooms with peeling wallpaper. At the end of the short hallway, a wall. She put her hand against it. Plaster, smooth, painted white. There was wallpaper at the base of the wall in the same floral pattern as the rest of the hallway, but the pattern was repeated half an inch differently. The colors were slightly off. Eldridge crouched down beside her. He ran his finger along the baseboard. This baseboard is pine, he said. The baseboard in the rest of the house is oak. Whoever built this wall used different wood than the original construction. This wall is not original. He knocked on it. The sound came back hollow. Not the deep, solid thud of plaster on lath on framing, a thin echo with empty air behind it. Tamsin pressed her palm flat against the plaster. She held it there. After a moment, she could feel it. The faintest draft of cool, stale air pushing very softly against her skin from the other side. She looked at her grandfather. He looked at her. "There's a room behind this wall," she said. "Yes." "Lavinia's room." "Probably." "We need to open it." He nodded. He stood up slowly with one hand on his knee because 74-year-old knees were not what they had been at 60. "We need tools," he said. "I need to go into town and get a chisel and a pry bar and a flashlight. I'd like to do this right. We're only going to have one chance to do it without damaging whatever is on the other side." "How long?" "Tomorrow morning. Early." Tamsin nodded. She stayed at the wall for a long time after her grandfather had gone back downstairs. She pressed her bandaged hand flat against the plaster very gently where the draft was coming through. The cool air pushed back against her palm, faint and steady, like the breathing of a small animal that had been asleep for a very long time. She closed her eyes. She thought of Lavinia Cresswell, 19 years old, sitting in a room on the other side of this wall, writing music for hands that did not work the way other hands worked. She thought of Theodora Cresswell sealing that room with plaster and pine because she could not bear to enter it, but she could not bear to destroy it either. She thought of her own mother's hands on hers on a piano bench in a house that no longer belonged to anyone she knew, teaching her Clair de Lune at 6 years old. She opened her eyes, she lowered her hand from the wall. She walked down the staircase and out onto the porch, and she sat beside her grandmother and put her right arm around her, and the two of them sat together and watched the morning shift across the elms. Tomorrow morning, they were going to open the wall. Tomorrow morning, they were going to find out what Lavinia Cresswell had left behind and what Theodora Cresswell had been so afraid to look at that she had walled it up and lived alone with it for the rest of her life. Tomorrow morning, the music was going to start again. But tonight the cupola caught the last of the evening sun, and the colors fell across the lawn the way they had not fallen in 63 years. Reds and greens and golds across the dry grass, and from inside the house, from somewhere very far behind the sealed wall, a soft draft moved through the boards, the way a held breath moves when a person is finally about to speak. Eldridge Bostwick left for the hardware store at 6 in the morning. He walked. The Buick was low on gas, and he did not want to spend money on fuel for a 3-mile errand when his own 2 feet had been carrying him to and from hardware stores for 57 years and had not failed him yet. Donovan Tice opened the door before Eldridge had time to knock. "Saw you coming from the window," Donovan said. He was in his 50s, broad in the shoulders, soft-spoken in a way that made people lean toward him to catch his words. "Coffee's on. I need a chisel, a pry bar, 2 flashlights, a box of rags, and a contractor bag." "For the Cresswell place." "Yes." "Going through a wall." "Yes." Donovan looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked into the back of the store without saying anything. When he came back, he had everything Eldridge had asked for, plus a roll of painter's plastic, a dust mask, and a small steel pan. "For catching the chunks," Donovan said, "so they don't crack the original floor underneath, if you got original floor underneath. You've thought about going through that wall. My granddaddy talked about it before he died. He helped lay the porch boards on that house in 1916. Said old Theodora paid in silver dollars and never said thank you, but she sent over a strawberry pie every July for the rest of his life. Said she was the saddest woman he ever knew." Eldridge nodded. He set his money on the counter. Donovan pushed it back. "On the account," Donovan said. "Pay when you can. And listen, Mr. Bostwick, whatever you find up there, you let me know if you need anything. Anything at all." Eldridge looked at him. "Why?" Donovan ran his thumb along the edge of the counter. "Because my granddaddy was the man who hammered the nails into the door of that sealed room," he said. "He did it for Theodora because she asked him to. He spent the rest of his life wondering if he should have refused. I'd like to be on the other side of that if I can." A boy was sitting on the porch steps when Eldridge walked back up the gravel circle to the mansion. He was 17 years old, tall and lean, with a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes and a pair of work boots that had seen real use. He stood up when Eldridge approached. "Mr. Bostwick?" "Yes." "My name is Cyrus Tipton. I live 4 doors down toward town. My grandma is Miss Loretta's second cousin, and she told me last night that you might be needing some help up here." Eldridge set down the bag from the hardware store. "How old are you, son?" "17, sir." "Why aren't you in school?" "I quit last year. My grandma's on oxygen. I help her in the mornings and evenings, and I do odd jobs in between. Mowing, gutters, hauling, whatever folks need." "What do you charge?" 15 an hour when I can get it. 15 an hour and everything I know about structural engineering. The boy looked at him. "Sir, I don't need to know about structural engineering." "You might. Come on." They were on the third floor at 7:30. Tamsin had been awake since 5. She had laid out the hammer and the pry bar and the cold chisel along the floor of the hallway with the careful, precise spacing of someone who had once been a piano student and had been taught early to respect the placement of objects in space. Cyrus stood in the hallway and looked at the wall. "There's really a room back there," he said. "There's really a room back there," Eldridge said. "How do you know?" "Pine baseboard, different wallpaper, and we can feel a draft." Cyrus pressed his hand against the plaster. He held it there. After a moment, his eyebrows lifted. "I can feel it." "Yes." "Mr. Bostwick, how long has this been sealed?" 68 years. Cyrus took off his cap, ran a hand through his hair, put the cap back on. He did that twice. Then he picked up the contractor bag and shook it open. "All right," he said. "Tell me where to stand." Eldridge handed Tamsin the chisel. She looked at him. "Grandpa?" "It's your wall, sweetheart. You bid on it. You should be the one to open it." She took the chisel. She took the hammer in her right hand. Her left hand was bandaged still, but it could close around the body of a chisel and hold it in place, and that was all this work required. She set the tip of the chisel against the plaster at the seam where the false wall met the original framing. She drew a long breath. She struck. A chunk of plaster fell. White dust rose around her. She struck again. Another chunk. Then another. The lath behind the plaster was thin pine strips nailed horizontally. She broke through them with the pry bar. Behind the lath was a gap of about 4 inches. And behind that gap, in the dim slice of light from her grandfather's flashlight, the surface of a door. Heavy oak, 6 panels, a brass knob tarnished nearly black, a brass keyhole. "There it is," Cyrus whispered. Tamsin worked carefully now. She cleared the plaster from around the doorframe piece by piece into the steel pan Donovan had given them. She brushed the dust away from the brass with the cuff of her sweatshirt. She put her hand on the knob. She tried it. It turned. The door did not move. "Locked," she said. Eldridge ran his hand along the top of the door frame. There was a narrow ledge of molding there, a thin shelf. His fingers brushed something small, something with weight. He held it up. A brass key, old, notched, heavy with dust. He looked at Tamsin. "She wanted somebody to find it," he said. "She didn't want to let anyone in, but she didn't want to lock it away forever either." Tamsin fit the key into the lock. It resisted for a moment. Then it turned with a small, dry click that echoed down the empty hallway. She put both hands on the door and pushed. A rush of cool, stale air met her. The smell was different from the rest of the house. Not dust and old wood. Something closer to paper and varnish and dried lavender. Cleaner. Older. Held in suspension for 68 years. Tamsin stepped in first. The room ran the full width of the east side of the mansion. It was large, far larger than the third-floor hallway had suggested. 2 tall windows looked out toward the morning, the glass streaked with decades of grime but unbroken. The morning light filtered through in pale golden bars that fell across the floor in long, quiet rectangles. In the center of the room, beneath a white cotton sheet that had yellowed with age, stood a shape they all recognized immediately: a grand piano. Around the walls, stacked on chairs and on the floor, and on a long, low bookshelf beneath the windows, were piles of paper. Hundreds of pages of sheet music handwritten in iron gall ink on yellowed staff paper. The same handwriting as the bench page, the same neat note heads, the same straight stems. Against the far wall stood a small walnut writing desk. On the slanted top of the desk, placed precisely in the center, was a sealed envelope. Nobody spoke. The room had the feeling of a place that had been waiting. Not abandoned. Waiting. Tamsin walked to the desk and picked up the envelope. The paper was brittle. The ink on the front had faded to a soft brown. It read, "To whoever finds this." She set it back down with the care of a person setting down a sleeping bird. Cyrus had not moved from the doorway. He had taken off his cap and was holding it against his chest with both hands. "Mr. Bostwick," he said softly. "Yes." "There's another door." Eldridge looked where the boy was pointing. In the far corner of the room, half hidden behind a tall mahogany screen, was a small door, lower than the one they had come through, maybe 4 feet high. The wood was unstained. The hinges were iron, not brass. There was a simple iron latch, no lock. Tamsin walked over to it. She moved the screen aside slowly. She turned the latch. The door swung inward, and a small breath of even cooler air came down from somewhere above. She had to bend to fit through the opening. On the other side was a narrow spiral staircase, iron-painted black, rising up and up inside what she now realized was the inside of the east octagonal tower. She looked back at her grandfather. "Go," he said. She climbed. The staircase wound up through the tower in tight spirals. She counted 32 steps. The walls were close on either side, painted a deep, dusty rose. There were small, round windows set into the curved wall every 9 steps, each one no larger than a dinner plate, and through them she caught flashes of the morning sky and the tops of the elms below. She came up through an opening in the floor of another room. She straightened. She stopped. The room she stood in was octagonal, 8 walls. Each wall was a tall stained glass window 15 feet high, set in delicate iron tracery. The colors fell across her face and her hands and her sweatshirt in a moving wash of reds and greens and golds. She lifted her bandaged hand, and the bandage turned crimson, then gold, then a pale leaf green. The ceiling rose above her in a vaulted dome of glass and iron. The center of the dome was clear and oculus, the size of a dinner table. Through it she could see the sky. In the middle of the floor stood a single object, a small upright piano, compact, a practice instrument, built into the floor on a raised wooden platform that had been carved to match the 8-sided shape of the room. The piano was perfectly aligned with the center of the dome. Tamsin walked toward it slowly. She circled it. 68 years of dust lay across the lid in a soft gray sheet. She lifted the corner of the dust sheet that had been draped over the keys and pulled it back. The keys were yellow ivory, the sharps a dark brown. The instrument was small, but it was a true piano with all 88 keys, and it was tuned. Or it had been tuned. The piano tuner, who would later confirm this, said the room had been so perfectly sealed that the air had not moved enough in 6 decades to detune the strings beyond half a cent. He had never seen anything like it in 40 years of working on pianos. Tamsin pressed middle C with her right index finger. The note rose. It did not stay in the room. It climbed. It climbed up into the dome, into the 8 walls of stained glass, and the glass caught it and held it for a half-second longer than glass should hold a sound, and then it released it, and the note bloomed back into the room from every direction at once. The shape of the room did something to the sound that ordinary rooms could not do. The note was warmer at the end than it had been at the beginning. It was rounder. It was held by the geometry of the space itself. Tamsin stood very still. She thought of what her grandfather had said on the porch the day before. Somebody who wanted the music to go further than the walls would let it. She walked to one of the stained glass windows. She looked through it. The window faced east. From this height, she could see the town below, the water tower, the church steeples, the roof of Loretta's diner, the grid of cornfields stretching toward the horizon. If she opened that window, if she opened all 8 windows, if somebody played this piano on a summer evening with the windows open, the music would carry. The cupola was an instrument. Her grandfather had been right. Cornelius Cresswell had built a stained glass loudspeaker on top of his daughter's house so that her playing could be heard a mile down into the town below. This was where Lavinia had played, not the grand piano downstairs, this one, up here, above the town, inside the lantern of colored glass. Tamsin pressed her bandaged left hand flat against the cool red of the window. She heard her grandfather's voice coming up the stairwell. "Sweetheart, what is it? What did you find?" She did not answer at first. She could not find the words. Then she said quietly into the strange ringing acoustics of the chamber, "Grandpa, come up. You need to see this." He came up. Wilhelmina came up behind him slowly with one hand on the iron rail. They came through the floor, opening one at a time, and they stood in the colored light, and neither of them spoke for almost a full minute. Wilhelmina sat down on the wooden platform beside the small piano. She placed her swollen, knotted hands on the keys. She played a quiet G major arpeggio. The room caught the chord. The room sang it back. She lifted her hands from the keys and pressed them against her face. Downstairs, they read the letter together. Tamsin had carried it down from the desk. She sat on the floor of the third-floor room beside the covered grand piano with her grandparents on either side of her, and Cyrus sitting cross-legged in the doorway with his cap still off. The morning light fell across the page in clean bars. She opened the envelope carefully with the flat edge of her thumbnail. The paper inside was 2 pages, both written in the same careful hand. She read it aloud. "My name is Theodora Cresswell. I am writing this letter in February of 1959, 1 year after the death of my daughter, Lavinia Ann Cresswell, who was 19 years old. Lavinia was a pianist. That is not enough to say. Lavinia was music itself. She heard things in the silence that the rest of us could not. She played her first recital at 7. She won the state competition at 12. By 15, she had been accepted to the conservatory in Cincinnati on full scholarship to begin when she turned 18. In the autumn of 1955, when she was 16, Lavinia was in an accident. A horse cart on the county road lost a wheel and struck her on the left side. Her left hand was badly injured. The doctor said she would regain most of the use, but the fine motor control, the speed and precision that a concert pianist requires, would not come back fully. Lavinia did not stop. She did not complain. She sat at the upright piano in the cupola the day she came home from the hospital with her left hand bandaged and swollen, and she began to compose. What she wrote was unlike anything I had ever heard. She composed music for hands that could not do what healthy hands could do. Wider fingerings, simplified chord voicings that still sounded full and rich. Pieces that a pianist with limited strength and reduced reach could play without pain and without the music suffering for it. She said she was writing for every pianist who had been told they could not play anymore. She composed for 3 years. Over 40 pieces for solo piano, several for piano and violin, a few for small ensembles. Each one annotated in her own hand with notes about the adapted fingerings and the reasons behind each choice. Lavinia died of pneumonia on March the 14th, 1958. She was 19 years old. It happened in 4 days. She was composing at this desk on a Monday and she was gone by Friday. I have sealed this room because I cannot bear to enter it. But I cannot destroy what she created. It is all I have left of her, and it is all she left of herself. In the drawer of this desk, you will find a bank book. I have placed $800 in a trust account at Marbury Savings. It is what remained of my husband Augustus's military insurance after his death in Korea, and every dollar I had been able to set aside since. I have asked the bank to hold the account in trust until someone presents this letter at their counter. The money is for this house and for music education, for those who need it most. If you are reading this letter, then someone has finally opened this room. I do not know who you are or how you came to be here, but I believe you were meant to find it. Please let the music live. Theodora Cresswell, February 1959. Tamsin set the letter down on the floor. Nobody spoke. Eldridge was looking at the covered grand. Wilhelmina was crying silently. Cyrus was looking at the floor. Tamsin stood up. She walked to the piano. She took hold of the dust sheet with both hands and pulled it off in one slow motion. The sheet slid to the floor in a soft pile of yellowed cotton. The grand was a Steinway Model B 7 feet long ebony case. The finish was dull from 68 years of still air, but the wood was intact. No cracks, no warping. The room had been sealed tight enough that the temperature and humidity had barely changed across the decades. She lifted the fallboard. The keys were the same yellowed ivory as the small piano in the cupola. The same dark sharps. On the music stand above the keys, someone had left a composition open. The title was written in Lavinia's handwriting at the top of the first page, "For Hands That Remember." Tamsin looked at the fingerings. She looked at them for a long time. She set the bandaged left hand on the keys. She did not need to read the notation. She had read it already on 3 photocopied pages in Dr. Matilda Rourke's office 6 months ago. She knew the first 8 bars by heart because she had stared at them every night for 3 weeks, trying to understand the logic of the fingerings, and now she was looking at them in the original hand, on the original paper in the room where they had been written, and the logic was suddenly blindingly obvious. The fingerings were not arbitrary. They were not the choices of an injured composer working around her own limitations. They were a method, a complete internally consistent system for playing the piano with limited mobility in the left hand. The thumb did what the ring finger normally did. The second finger took over chord voicings. The wrist rotated to compensate for what the fingers could not do alone. The composer had built a pedagogy. She had built it for herself, but she had built it so that anyone with a similar injury could use it, and the music would sound full and rich and complete, not compromised. It was the same pedagogy Dr. Rourke had been developing in her research papers. It was the same pedagogy Tamsin had been teaching herself for 6 months. Lavinia Cresswell had invented it in 1955. Tamsin pressed the first chord. Her bandaged left hand reached every note. Not by stretching, not by compensating, because the chord had been written for her hand, for the hands she now had, for hands that could not span an octave with the fourth and fifth fingers, for hands that had to use thumb and middle finger where another pianist would use ring and pinky. She played the second chord, then the third, then the first phrase. The melody rose from the old piano, slightly out of tune, but clear, warm at the bottom, bright at the top, a melody that was simple on the surface and grew in complexity as it moved forward, and her hands followed it, and her fingers found every note, because Lavinia had put every note exactly where damaged hands could find them. Tamsin played the first page, then the second. She had not cried in 6 months. She had not cried at the funeral. She had not cried in the hospital. She had not cried in the practice room at the conservatory or in the parking lot outside the realtor's office. She cried now, quietly, her eyes still on the page, her hands still moving across the keys. Wilhelmina had gone to the floor beside the piano. She was sitting with her arms around herself, listening with her eyes closed. Eldridge was standing by the desk. His hand was on the back of his neck. He was looking at his wife with an expression Tamsin had not seen on his face since the day her mother had died. When she stopped playing, the silence in the room was different from the silence that had been there when they had first opened the door. Before, it had been the silence of a place that was sealed. Now it was the silence of a place that had been opened. In the drawer of the desk, there was a small leather-bound bank book with a brass clasp. Eldridge took it out. He opened it. A single line of bank teller script in faded blue ink. $800 deposited February the 3rd, 1958. A trust account, held until the holder of the accompanying letter should present at the counter. He handed it to Tamsin. "I'll go," she said. "I should come with you." No, Grandpa, I should go alone. He looked at her. Then he nodded. She drove the Buick down Cresswell Hill Road into Marbury at 10 in the morning. The Marbury Savings Bank was a small brick building on Main Street, 2 doors down from the diner. The brass plaque by the door read, "Established 1897." Inside the bank had 2 teller windows and a small waiting area with 3 wooden chairs. A young woman with dark hair and a name tag that read Patrice looked up from her ledger when Tamsin approached. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "I'd like to inquire about an account." Tamsin set the bank book on the counter. Patrice opened it. She read the account number. She typed it into her computer. She typed it again. She looked at the screen. She looked at the bank book. She looked at Tamsin. "Miss, this account was opened in 1958. Yes, it's a trust. It's been compounding interest for 68 years. I see that. Is it still active?" Patrice picked up the phone on her desk. She did not take her eyes off the screen. "Mr. Forsyth, can you come out here for a moment?" She set the phone down. She looked at Tamsin with an expression that was not quite shock and not quite disbelief, but was somewhere on the border between them. "Our manager will be right out," she said. "You might want to sit down." Sterling Forsyth was in his 60s. Gray suit, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He had managed Marbury Savings for 23 years, and his father had managed it for 28 years before that. He brought Tamsin back into a small office behind the teller windows and closed the door. "Miss Vance," he said. "Yes." "I have never in my career seen this happen." "What?" He turned the computer screen toward her. "Theodora Cresswell opened this trust account on February the 3rd, 1958. She deposited $800 and left written instructions in our archives. The account was to remain open, earning interest until someone presented the bank book and the accompanying letter. She specified the wording, 'To whoever finds this.' Those were her words, and the bank just held it. A trust with clear terms does not expire. The principal moved through several instruments over the years. Standard savings instrument until 1971. Certificate of deposit from 1971 through 1989. Conservative bond fund from 89 to 2004. Treasury index fund from 2004 to the present. Every transition followed the trust's original terms. Safe, low risk, steady growth. He paused. He turned the screen further so she could read it. $127,438.41. Tamsin sat back in the chair. Miss Vance Theodora's letter specified 2 permitted uses: maintenance and restoration of the property at 14 Cresswell Hill Road, and music education for those who need it most. Those are the only permitted uses under the trust terms. The funds cannot be withdrawn for personal use, cannot be transferred to a third party, cannot be used to purchase any other property. The terms are airtight. She thought of everything. She had a good lawyer, or a very clear mind, possibly both. He folded his hands on the desk. "Miss Vance, I would like to say something, and you should know that I am saying it as a man and not as a banker. My grandmother knew Theodora Cresswell. They sat together at the Methodist Church on Sunday mornings for the last 6 years of Theodora's life. My grandmother told me once that Theodora used to sit in the back pew during the hymns and move her fingers very slightly along the wood of the pew in front of her the way a person plays the piano in their head. She did that every Sunday. She never sang. She just moved her fingers. My grandmother said it was the saddest thing she had ever seen and the most determined thing she had ever seen at the same time." He paused. "I'm glad somebody finally opened that room." Tamsin walked back to the Buick with the bank book in her jacket and Sterling Forsyth's business card in her pocket. She drove up Cresswell Hill Road. Her grandparents and Cyrus were on the porch when she pulled into the gravel circle. They stood up when they saw her face. She told them the number, she told them the terms. Wilhelmina sat down very slowly on the top porch step. She pressed both palms flat against her knees. $127,000, she said, "for this house and for music." for this house, and for music. Cyrus took off his cap. He did not put it back on for a long time. The work changed after that, not in kind, in scope. Eldridge stopped patching and started rebuilding. He drew up plans on graph paper at the kitchen table, working from the original house structure he had mapped during their first inspection. Tamsin sat across from him with a yellow legal pad and a calculator and ran the numbers herself, line by line, because she was the trustee now in everything but name, and she would not be a sloppy one. They replaced the roof over 2 weeks. Cyrus on the ladder, Eldridge on the ground calling instructions up. Donovan Tice delivered the shingles at cost. An electrician from a town 20 miles east rewired the first 3 floors and charged them less than half his normal rate because his daughter had been one of Wilhelmina's piano students in Illinois 15 years ago, and he had been waiting half his life for an opportunity to repay a teacher he could not otherwise reach. The plumber from the Methodist church ran new copper lines to the second-floor bathroom and would not take payment. A piano tuner from the county seat drove out and spent 4 hours bringing the Steinway back to concert pitch. Then he climbed the spiral staircase and spent another 3 hours on the cupola upright. He had been tuning pianos for 41 years. He told Eldridge when he came down that he had never tuned an instrument in a room like that one before, and that he was going to drive home tonight and tell his wife about it, and she was not going to believe him. He left without charging. Word got around the way word gets around in a small town. A woman knocked on the door on a Tuesday afternoon. She had her daughter standing behind her. The girl was 11 years old, small for her age, with dark braids and a serious face. "Are you the piano teacher?" the woman said. Wilhelmina had not called herself that in 5 years. "I used to be. My daughter Annalise wants to learn. She's got a situation with her right hand." The woman paused. The girl held up her hand. The third and fourth fingers were scarred and stiff. "A farming accident," the woman explained, with a corn picker 2 years ago. She had nearly lost the whole hand. The surgeons had saved most of it, but the fine control was gone. "We've been to 3 teachers in the county. 2 of them said she'd never play properly. The third said he could teach her left hand only with simplified pieces. She didn't want simplified." Wilhelmina looked at the girl. The girl looked back at her with the stubborn expression of someone who had been told no and did not accept it. "Come in," Wilhelmina said. She started Annalise on Lavinia's beginning exercises that same afternoon. Within 20 minutes, the girl was playing a simple melody with both hands. Her damaged fingers found the adapted positions Lavinia had designed, and the notes came out clean and full. The girl smiled for the first time since she had walked through the door. 3 more students came that week, then 2 more. Wilhelmina taught in the parlor on a donated upright that the Methodist Church had been storing in a back room since 1974. Tamsin taught alongside her. She taught the older students. She taught the ones whose hands had been told they were finished. A retired farmer named Burton, who had stopped playing 20 years ago when his arthritis had set in. A former school secretary in her 60s who had been told by her doctor that fine motor activities would help slow the progression of her tremor. They sat at the donated upright and played Lavinia's simplest pieces slowly and carefully, and the music came out. "She wrote for us," Burton said one afternoon, looking at his hands on the keys. "This girl who died before I was born wrote this music for exactly these hands." "She did," Tamsin said. "That's exactly what she did." She taught from a yellow notebook now. She copied Lavinia's annotations into the notebook in her own hand, and she added her own annotations beneath them. She was building a method book. She did not call it that yet, but she was building one. Dr. Matilda Rourke arrived on a Friday morning. She had driven 7 hours from Cincinnati. Tamsin had called her on Tuesday and had said only this: "I think I have found her." Matilda Rourke stood in the doorway of the third-floor room and did not speak for almost 5 minutes. She walked from stack to stack of sheet music. She lifted the corner of one page, then another, with the careful touch of a person handling something that might be made of ash. She read the annotations in the margins. She read Theodora's letter. She read it again. She turned to Tamsin. "How many compositions?" she said. 43. Cyrus counted yesterday. 31 for solo piano, 7 for piano and violin, 3 for piano and cello, 2 for small ensembles. And you've been playing them every day, with your hand. Yes. Matilda Rourke sat down on the floor of the room. She had brought a leather portfolio with her, and she opened it now, and she pulled out a stack of papers and laid them on the floor. They were the 3 photocopied pages of the Marbury Anonymous, the ones she had been carrying in that folder for 15 years. She laid them beside one of Lavinia's compositions. The handwriting was identical. She closed her eyes for a long moment. "Miss Vance," she said, "do you understand what this is?" "I think so." "Tell me what you think it is." "It's a complete adaptive piano method, invented by a 19-year-old composer in 1955. The same method we have been developing in academic settings since the late 1970s. She got there first, by 20 years, maybe more." "Yes, that is what it is, and it has been sealed inside a wall in Iowa for 68 years. She looked at the grand piano, at the desk, at the chair Lavinia had sat in. "With your permission," she said, "I would like to bring 2 colleagues from the conservatory and from the Historical Preservation Society at the university. They will want to evaluate the collection for possible publication. We would propose a scholarly edition, with historical context, with critical notes, and with your annotations from your teaching if you would be willing to contribute them." Tamsin looked at her grandmother. Wilhelmina nodded once. "Theodora wanted the music to live," Wilhelmina said. "We will give it to whoever can keep it alive." "Yes," Tamsin said. On a Wednesday afternoon, 6 weeks after the first chunk of plaster had fallen from the false wall, a black sedan pulled up to the gravel circle at the end of Cresswell Hill Road. Tamsin was on the front porch. Cyrus was on the second-floor scaffolding, repainting a section of trim. Eldridge was in the side yard stacking the last of the demolition lumber for Donovan's wood stove. A man got out of the driver's side. He was tall, mid-50s. He had thinning gray hair and a dark suit and no tie. His shoes were polished. He carried himself like a man who had been told all his life that he was the most important person in any room he entered. Tamsin had not seen him in 7 months. Maxwell Bostwick walked up the gravel path. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked up at the house, the new paint, the repaired porches, the clean gutters, the flower beds along the front walk that Loretta and 3 women from the church had planted in October, the brass plaque by the gate that read Marbury Adaptive Music Foundation established 2025. His face did not change, but his eyes moved across all of it, and Tamsin could see the small calculations happening behind them. A second person got out of the passenger side, a woman in a charcoal blazer with a leather portfolio under her arm. She was not someone Tamsin recognized. She did not look like an associate. She looked like a lawyer. Maxwell smiled at Tamsin. It was the same smile he had used in the hospital room when he had stood beside her bed with the clipboard. "Tamsin," he said, "sweetheart, you've been busy." She did not stand up from the porch step. "What do you want?" "I want to talk. May we come up?" "You can talk from where you are." The smile thinned. The lawyer beside him opened her portfolio. She did not look at Tamsin. She looked at her papers. Maxwell folded his hands behind his back. "Tamsin, I am here in the capacity of next of kin, and I am here with concern for your well-being and for the well-being of your grandparents." Eldridge had walked around the side of the house. He stopped at the corner of the porch and stood very still. Cyrus had set his paintbrush down on the scaffolding board. He was watching from the second floor. "I have filed a petition in the Linden County Probate Court," Maxwell said, "for conservatorship over your grandfather Eldridge, and, after a careful review of your medical records from your time in the hospital, over you as well." The lawyer took a step forward. She pulled a folder from her portfolio and held it out to Tamsin. "Miss Vance, you have been served. The hearing is scheduled for 2 weeks from Friday. You will need to retain counsel and respond to the petition by close of business on the day before the hearing. Failure to respond will be considered a default, and the petition may be granted in absentia. She set the folder on the porch step beside Tamsin. Maxwell smiled again. Smaller this time. Tighter. It's for your own good, sweetheart. You've been through so much. The brain injury from the accident, the pressure of dropping out of the conservatory. This adventure of buying a condemned building with my elderly father's money. These are not the decisions of a sound mind. We just want to make sure you're protected. He paused. And the trust, of course. Once the conservatorship is granted, the trustee duties will transfer to me. I have a fiduciary obligation to make sure that money is being managed appropriately. I will, of course, allow you and your grandparents to continue living here, for as long as I deem appropriate. Tamsin looked at him for a long moment. She did not pick up the folder. She did not stand up. Maxwell, yes. You forged a power of attorney to sell the house I grew up in. You sold my mother's piano. You took my grandfather's house out from under him with a sign on the lawn. You sold my grandmother's wedding china. And now you have come here where I am rebuilding something with my own hands, and you have told me that I am not of sound mind. Sweetheart, you should leave. Tamsin, be reasonable. You should leave Maxwell, now, and you should not come back until you are summoned by the court. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned. The lawyer turned with him. They walked down the gravel path. They got in the car. They drove away. Eldridge walked up the porch steps. He sat down beside her. He picked up the folder. He opened it. He read the petition. He set it down on the step between them. 2 weeks, he said. 2 weeks. He looked at her. There was no fear in his face. There was something else. There was a quiet, steady anger of the kind that took 74 years to learn how to hold. What do you want to do? She looked up at the cupola. The afternoon sun was coming through the western windows now, reds and golds across the white-painted porch column beside her. I want to play, she said, tonight, with all the cupola windows open. I want everyone in this town to hear what we found. He nodded. That evening after the dinner Loretta had brought from the diner, Tamsin climbed the spiral staircase inside the East Tower. She climbed alone. Her grandparents stayed in the parlor below. She walked through the small door at the top of the staircase into the cupola. She crossed the wooden platform. She knelt at each of the 8 stained glass windows in turn, and one by one she lifted the iron latches and pushed the panes outward on their old hinges. The autumn air came in. She sat at the small upright piano. She opened the manuscript book Cyrus had carried up for her to the piece Lavinia had titled, Letter to Someone I Haven't Met. She set her bandaged left hand on the keys. She played. Below her in the gathering dark, the music spilled out through the 8 open windows of the cupola and rolled down across the porches and the lawn and down Cresswell Hill Road and into the streets of Marbury. Loretta heard it as she was locking the door of the diner. She stood on the sidewalk with the keys in her hand and did not move. Cyrus heard it from his grandmother's porch 4 houses down on Cresswell Hill. He sat on the steps. His grandmother sat in her chair beside him with her oxygen tube around her ears, and she closed her eyes and listened. Sterling Forsythe heard it from his front yard. He had been carrying a bag of groceries from his car. He set the bag down on the lawn and stood beside it. Donovan Tice heard it from inside his hardware store where he was finishing a late inventory. He turned out the lights one by one and went to the window and stood with his hand against the glass. A woman in her 70s heard it from her front porch and did not know that she had been waiting all her life to hear it. She had been Lavinia's classmate at Marbury High School in 1956. She had not heard her friend play since the funeral. She sat down in her porch chair. She cried into her hands. One by one in the streets of Marbury on a Wednesday evening in October, people came out of their houses or paused on the sidewalk or stood in their yards, and they listened. The music carried. The music did what Cornelius Cresswell had built the cupola to do 140 years before. It went further than the walls would let it. The morning after the music spilled across the town, the first person to knock on the door of the wedding cake mansion was a woman Tamsin had never met. She was 78 years old. She wore a long wool coat and a pair of practical brown shoes. Her hair was the color of an old pearl. She held a small brown envelope in both hands, the way a person carries a thing she has been carrying for a long time. Tamsin opened the door. "Miss Vance?" "Yes, ma'am." "My name is Charlotte Pruitt. I was Lavinia Cresswell's classmate. We graduated from Marbury High School together in 1956. I was at her funeral. I have not heard her play since that summer. I heard her play last night." Tamsin stepped back from the door. "Please, come in." Charlotte Pruitt walked into the foyer and looked up at the staircase and pressed one hand against her mouth. "My God," she said, "it's the same house." She had brought the envelope for Tamsin. Inside was a black and white photograph taken in May of 1957, 6 months before Lavinia died. The two girls were sitting on the front porch of this mansion, on the steps Tamsin sat on every evening now. Lavinia had her left arm wrapped in a cloth sling. She was laughing at something Charlotte had said. The sun was on her face. She was alive and she was happy, and she had 2 more years to compose 43 pieces of music before the pneumonia came for her. Tamsin held the photograph for a long time. She had never seen Lavinia's face before. The girl in the photograph had the same shape of jaw that Tamsin had, the same set of the shoulders. They could have been cousins if the years had lined up differently. They were not. But the resemblance was the kind of resemblance that a person feels rather than sees the way you feel, a current of cold air through a closed door. Charlotte stayed for an hour. She drank a cup of coffee in the parlor. She told Tamsin 3 stories about Lavinia that no historian had ever heard because Charlotte had never told them to anyone. She had carried them for 68 years. When she left, she pressed Tamsin's right hand between both of her own. "Whatever you need," she said. "Whatever this town needs to do, whatever testimony anyone needs from anyone, you call me first. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "The man who is doing this to you, he is not the first man in this country to try to take what a woman has built. He will not be the last, but he is not going to do it here, not in Marbury." She walked down the porch steps. She got in her old sedan. She drove away. Within 3 days, every house on Cresswell Hill Road had a single light burning in the front window after sundown. Loretta organized it. She did not call it a vigil, she called it courtesy lighting. She said the term very seriously, with the reading glasses pushed up on the bridge of her nose, and nobody argued with her. The petition hearing was 13 days away. Tamsin sat at the kitchen table with the petition in front of her. She read it through 3 times. The petition asserted 2 grounds. First, that Eldridge Bostwick had demonstrated cognitive impairment by purchasing a condemned property with no rational basis for restoration. Second, that Tamsin Vance had sustained traumatic brain injury during the motor vehicle accident of the previous spring and had subsequently dropped out of an academic program and engaged in financial decision-making inconsistent with her pre-injury capacity. The petition requested conservatorship over both, with Maxwell Bostwick named as conservator and trustee. Eldridge sat across from her with his hands folded. Wilhelmina was beside him. "We can fight this," Eldridge said. "I know. We have to be careful. The standard for cognitive incapacity is not common sense. It's medical. We will need physicians. We will need testimony. We will need documentation." "I know, Grandpa. You're going to have to put your medical records in front of a judge, your brain scans, your discharge summary, the doctor's notes from the rehab unit." "I know." "And the conservatory transcripts. And Dr. Rourke." "I know." He looked at her. "Sweetheart, you don't have to do this alone. I'm not alone, but I have to be the one who does it. Maxwell told a judge that I am not of sound mind. The only person who can stand in front of that judge and prove him wrong is me." He nodded. She wrote a list on the yellow legal pad. Documents needed: conservatory transcripts, discharge summary from rehab, 6-month post-injury neuropsychological evaluation, statements from Dr. Rourke and from her hand surgeon, Statement from Sterling Forsythe regarding her management of the trust. Statement from Donovan Tice regarding her purchases at the hardware store. Statement from Loretta. Statement from Cyrus's grandmother. Statement from Charlotte Pruitt. The brass plaque from the gate. The student enrollment ledger. The yellow notebook containing the method book she had been writing. She wrote everything she could think of. Then she wrote it again in a cleaner hand in order of importance. At the bottom of the page, she wrote in her own handwriting slowly with the pencil pressed hard against the paper, "I am going to win this." She underlined it twice. The next day, Eldridge took her aside in the kitchen. "I want you to go to the bank," he said, "and I want you to ask Sterling to pull the paper archives on the trust, not the digital records. The paper. Everything they have, every receipt, every transfer, every deposit, from 1958 forward." Why? Because the court is going to ask us to demonstrate that we have been managing the trust competently. And I want to know everything about how that trust was set up. Because Theodora Cresswell did not strike me as a woman who did anything by halves. And if she put $800 in that account in 1958, I want to know what she did after that. Tamsin looked at him. "You think there's more?" "I think Theodora Cresswell lived for 5 years after she sealed that room. And I think a woman with her clarity of mind did not stop thinking about her daughter's legacy on the day she sealed the door." Tamsin drove the Buick down Cresswell Hill Road at 10 in the morning. Sterling Forsythe brought her into the small office behind the teller windows again. He listened to her request. He did not interrupt. When she was finished, he sat back in his chair and ran a hand across his jaw. "Miss Vance, the paper archives on a trust account that old are not in this building. They are in a storage facility in the county seat. We keep the original signed documents and a binder of quarterly statements for every active trust we manage. The Cresswell Trust has been active continuously for 68 years. The binder is going to be substantial." "How long to retrieve it?" "I can have it driven up this afternoon, 3 o'clock, if you can come back." "I'll be back at 3. She drove back up the hill. She told her grandfather. She told her grandmother. She climbed the spiral staircase into the cupola and sat at the small upright piano and played the simplest of Lavinia's pieces, the one for absolute beginners, the one called First Steps. She played it 3 times, slowly, to steady her hands. At 3 o'clock, she was back at the bank. Sterling Forsythe brought her into a small conference room. On the table sat a battered cardboard banker's box. Across the top in faded marker, someone had written Cresswell T. Trust, 1958 to present. He set a pair of cotton archivist's gloves beside it. "My grandfather started using gloves with old documents in 1961, he said. "It was a habit my father continued. I keep a pair in my desk for occasions like this one." Tamsin pulled the gloves on. She lifted the lid of the box. Inside were 3 thick binders and a manila folder. Sterling set the binders on the table one at a time. He opened the manila folder and laid it flat. "This is the original trust instrument, signed by Theodora Cresswell on January the 29th, 1958, 5 days before the initial deposit, witnessed by my grandfather and by an attorney named Reuben Lassiter. Mr. Lassiter died in 1967. She read the trust instrument, 3 pages single-spaced in a careful black hand. The terms were as Sterling had described them. The funds were to be used for the maintenance and restoration of the property at 14 Cresswell Hill Road, and for music education for those who needed it most. The trust was to be held until the holder of an accompanying letter presented at the bank counter. The trust could not be transferred, could not be assigned, could not be borrowed against, could not be used for personal expenditure of any kind by any holder. The instrument had been written like a vault. She closed the folder. She opened the first binder. The first page was the original deposit slip. February the 3rd, 1958. $800. Cash. She turned the page. The second deposit was dated April the 17th, 1959. 14 months later. $47. Cash. She looked up at Sterling. What? Keep going, Miss Vance. She turned the page. July the 2nd, 1959. $63. Cash. September the 18th, 1959. $51. Cash. November the 8th, 1959. $72. Cash. She turned the pages faster. Her hand was steady. Her bandaged hand rested on the table beside the binder. The deposits continued every 6 to 8 weeks, from April of 1959 through the autumn of 1963. Small amounts, never large. $40, $60, once $112 in February of 1961. The last deposit was on November the 22nd, 1963. $40. Cash. Theodora Cresswell had died on December the 11th, 1963. Tamsin counted the deposits with the back of a pen. She added them up on the legal pad she had brought with her. $3,247. She looked up. Sterling. Yes. What was she making in 1960? My grandfather's records show she was teaching 7 piano students in the back parlor of her own house. He noted it once in the margin of an account ledger. He said she charged $1.50 per half-hour lesson. $1.50 per lesson. Yes. Sterling. She was depositing her teaching income. Yes. Into the trust. Yes. He paused. Miss Vance, there is more. He turned to the second binder. In 1961, Theodora Cresswell wrote a letter to my grandfather. He kept it in the trust file because he could not figure out what to do with it. The letter was not part of the trust instrument. It was a personal note. He turned a page in the binder. A handwritten letter on yellowed stationery, the same hand as the sealed room letter. Sterling read it aloud slowly. Mr. Forsyth, I have been thinking about the trust I established 3 years ago. The money is for Lavinia's house and for music education for those who need it most. I have come to believe that I cannot wait for someone to find the room. I have come to believe that the work has to begin now. I have begun teaching 7 students from the town. I am not charging them. I am paying for their lesson books out of my own pocket. The income I would have collected from their lessons, I am depositing into the trust. I do this so that when the room is open, the trust will reflect not only my husband's insurance, but also the work of the years I lived after my daughter. Please do not list these students by name in the trust records. I do not want their families to feel they have been the objects of charity. I want them to feel they have been the recipients of music. The two are not the same thing. Theodora Cresswell, March 1961. Sterling lowered the letter. He picked up a smaller folder from beneath the binders. My grandfather did not list the students in the trust records as Theodora requested, but he kept his own private list, in his own files. I found it last night after you called. It has not been opened in 50 years. He handed the folder to Tamsin. Inside was a single sheet of paper, 7 names written in a careful hand, each name followed by the years of lessons, 1959 to 1963. The handwriting was Sterling Forsyth's grandfather's. Tamsin read down the list. She read it twice. Her hand stopped halfway down the second reading. She looked up at Sterling. This name. Yes. Marguerite Renwick, 1960 to 1963. Yes. Sterling. Annalise Renwick is in my parlor right now learning piano on a piano her great-grandmother learned on. From a teacher who was paid by a trust her great-grandmother helped fund through her own free lessons. Yes, Miss Vance. That is what the records show. Tamsin set the folder down on the table. She did not move for a long time. The afternoon sun came through the small office window and laid a single bar of light across the cardboard banker's box. Sterling. Yes. What is the trust worth today, with the additional deposits compounded? He had already opened the calculator on his computer. He had been waiting for her to ask. He turned the screen. $487,602.18. She stared at the number. She set both hands flat on the table. She started to laugh, very quietly. Then she started to cry. Then she laughed again. Sterling Forsythe had been managing trust accounts for 23 years, and his father had managed them for 28 years before that. And he had never in his career seen a young woman do both of those things at the same time. But he understood it because he had been thinking about Theodora Cresswell for 2 days straight, and he had begun to understand a number of things he had not previously understood. He handed her a clean tissue from the box on his desk. "Miss Vance?" "Yes." "You are going to have a very productive court hearing." The hearing was on a Friday morning in late October. The courthouse was the same building where Tamsin had bid $12 on the mansion 8 weeks before. The hearing was held in a small second-floor courtroom with oak wainscoting and a single row of windows overlooking Main Street. Tamsin wore a navy dress that Wilhelmina had bought her at the church thrift store. Her left hand was no longer bandaged. The scars across the back of her hand were visible. She had stopped trying to hide them. She had retained a lawyer. Her name was Imogene Lassiter. She was 61 years old. She was the granddaughter of Reuben Lassiter, the attorney who had witnessed the original trust instrument in 1958. She had read the trust instrument and the petition in Tamsin's medical records, and she had agreed to take the case for a fee that Sterling Forsythe described as nominal. Maxwell Bostwick sat at the petitioner's table with his lawyer. The lawyer was the woman in the charcoal blazer. Maxwell did not look at Tamsin. The judge was named Constance Whitford. She was in her late 50s. She had been on the bench for 14 years. She listened to the petitioner's case first. Maxwell's lawyer presented the petition. She introduced exhibits. She presented evidence of the $12 mansion purchase. She presented evidence of Tamsin's hospitalization, her coma, her brain injury, her dropping out of the conservatory. She painted a picture of an old man and a young injured woman making impulsive decisions with limited family oversight. She used the phrase shared cognitive vulnerability. She used the phrase pattern of impaired judgment. She requested a temporary conservatorship pending further evaluation. When she finished, Maxwell straightened the cuffs of his suit jacket. Imogene Lassiter rose. "Your Honor, we will be brief." She introduced Tamsin's conservatory transcripts, 3.9 grade point average through the spring of her sophomore year, a leave of absence rather than a withdrawal, a standing invitation to return that fall. She introduced Tamsin's neuropsychological evaluation dated 6 weeks ago, conducted by a clinical neuropsychologist in Cedar Rapids. The evaluation showed full cognitive recovery across every measured domain: memory, executive function, attention, reasoning, verbal fluency. The evaluation noted that the patient had sustained a left ulnar nerve injury during the motor vehicle accident with no concurrent neurological deficits. The evaluator had concluded with the sentence, "This examinee is not only cognitively intact, she is cognitively exceptional." She introduced Eldridge Bostwick's structural engineer's license, current and in good standing through the state of Illinois. She introduced his certification of the property's foundation and framing drafted in his own hand on engineering letterhead dated the day after they had taken possession. She introduced the binders from Sterling Forsythe, the deposit history of the Cresswell Trust, the supplementary deposits made by Theodora between 1959 and 1963, the current balance. She introduced the brass plaque from the front gate of the foundation. She introduced the student enrollment ledger with 7 names. She introduced the yellow notebook containing Tamsin's adaptive piano method. She introduced Dr. Mathilde Rourke's letter from the Cincinnati Conservatory, written on official letterhead, attesting to the historical significance of the Cresswell compositions and the academic competence of Miss Vance as a documentarian and pedagogue of that work. She introduced Charlotte Pruitt's signed statement. She introduced Loretta Bissay's signed statement, Donovan Tice's signed statement, Sterling Forsythe's signed statement, The statement from Cyrus's grandmother, the statement from Burton, the retired farmer whose hands had remembered, the statement from the school secretary with the tremor, the statement from Annalise Renwick's mother. She set each one on the bench in front of Judge Whitford in a neat stack. Then she turned to Tamsin. Your Honor, I would now like to call my client to the stand. Tamsin walked to the witness chair. She was sworn in. She sat down. Imogene Lassiter walked to a podium and rested her hands on it. Miss Vance, in the past 8 weeks you have purchased a condemned mansion at public auction. You have organized its restoration. You have managed the disbursement of a trust valued at nearly $500,000. You have established an active music education program that currently serves 11 students. You have collaborated with a senior faculty member of a major conservatory on the academic preservation of a historically significant body of musical composition. You have taught yourself the adaptive piano techniques you needed to play your own instrument again using only the manuscripts of a woman who has been dead for 68 years. Is that an accurate summary of your activities? Yes. How would you describe the state of your mind during this period? Tamsin paused. She looked at her grandparents in the second row of the gallery. She looked at Loretta. She looked at Cyrus standing against the back wall. She looked at Charlotte Pruitt, who had driven in for the hearing in her old sedan and had brought Annalise Renwick's grandmother as a passenger. She looked at Sterling Forsythe in the third row, holding the binder of trust records in his lap. She looked at Maxwell. My mind is clear, she said. Clearer than it has been in 7 months. I have been doing the work of my life. I have been teaching children who were told their hands were broken, that their hands are not broken. I have been managing a trust according to the explicit terms set by the woman who created it 68 years ago in this town for this purpose. I have been doing it because the woman who created it asked me to. She left a letter. I read it. I am doing what she asked. I am 22 years old. My parents are dead. My left hand does not work the way it used to work. I dropped out of a conservatory because I could not sit in a practice room any longer and pretend that the music I had been training to play was the only music in the world. I came home to find that my uncle had sold the house I grew up in by forging a power of attorney I signed when I was on morphine 3 days after my parents' funeral. I drove east because my grandmother called me from a Walmart parking lot. I found her. I found my grandfather. I bought a house for $12 because we had nowhere to live. I opened a sealed room because a woman who died 63 years ago left a key for whoever might find her. I have given that woman's music back to the world. And my uncle has come into this courtroom to tell you that I am not of sound mind. She paused. Your Honor, I have never been more of sound mind than I am right now. The courtroom was quiet for a long moment. Judge Whitford looked at Maxwell. She looked at Imogene Lassiter. She looked at the stack of evidence on her bench. She took off her reading glasses and set them down on the desk. The petition is denied, she said, in its entirety, without prejudice to the petitioner's right to refile if circumstances materially change, which on this record I do not anticipate. She paused. For the record, I would like to note that this court has reviewed the chain of custody on the document submitted as Exhibit A by the petitioner. The power of attorney granting Mr. Bostwick financial authority over Miss Vance's affairs. I am referring this exhibit to the county sheriff's office for further investigation. There appear to be questions about its authenticity that this court is not in a position to resolve, but which are within the jurisdiction of the criminal authorities. Maxwell did not move. His lawyer touched his elbow. He stood up slowly. He walked out of the courtroom. He did not look at Tamsin. He did not look at his father. He did not look at anyone. He never came back to Marbury. 2 weeks after the hearing on a Tuesday afternoon, the kitchen phone rang. Tamsin answered it. She did not recognize the number. The area code was a familiar one. The voice that spoke on the other end was a voice she had not heard in almost a year. Tamsin. She knew it instantly. Roland. He was her uncle, her grandfather's second son, her mother's younger brother, 42 years old. He had disappeared from her grandparents' lives 9 months ago without explanation after a phone call between him and Maxwell that nobody had ever fully understood. He had not been at her parents' funeral. He had not been at the hospital. He had not called. I saw the article, he said, in the Cedar Rapids paper about the trust, about what you did at the hearing. All right. Tamsin, I would like to come see you, if you will let me. I would like to come see your grandmother and your grandfather. I have not earned the right to ask. I am asking anyway. She thought for a long time. When? Whenever you say, today, tomorrow. I can be there in 5 hours. Saturday, she said. Saturday morning, 10 o'clock. You come alone. You bring nothing. You stay as long as my grandmother wants you to stay. Not 1 minute longer. All right. Roland. Yes. Why now? He was quiet for a long time. Because the day Maxwell told me he was going to sell my parents' house, I should have driven over and stopped him. I sat in my kitchen and I let him do it. I have been sitting with that every day since. I am not asking for forgiveness. I am asking to come see my mother. She hung up. She stood in the kitchen for a long time. She told her grandmother that evening. Wilhelmina listened with her hands folded in her lap. When Tamsin was finished, Wilhelmina said only one thing. He was always the quieter one. Maxwell used to take his lunch money from him when they were little. I should have done more then. I didn't. I thought boys would work it out among themselves. They never do. Roland arrived at 9:53 on Saturday morning. He drove a 5-year-old Honda. He wore a wool jacket and jeans and brown work boots that did not match the jacket. He looked older than 42. He had thinning hair and tired eyes and a face that had not slept well in a year. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps with a small wooden box in his hands. He did not come up. Wilhelmina opened the screen door. She walked out onto the porch. She came down the steps slowly with one hand on the railing. She stopped 2 steps above him. She looked at him. He held up the box. He did not say anything. He opened it. Inside, resting on a folded square of black velvet, was a thin gold wedding band polished with a small chip of garnet set in the center. The band was old. The garnet had been recut at least twice. It was the ring Wilhelmina's mother had worn for 53 years of marriage. The ring Wilhelmina had inherited at her mother's death in 1988. The ring Maxwell had taken from her jewelry box in the spring, 2 days before he had sold the house. Wilhelmina put one hand over her mouth. Roland's voice was very small. He pawned it. In the spring, I found out from his secretary in October. She told me she had seen the receipt on his desk and had felt sick about it. I started calling pawn shops. I called every pawn shop within 100 miles of his office. I made a spreadsheet. I went in person to 17 of them. The shop on Meridian Street still had it. They had been planning to melt it down next month. I bought it back for $1,400. He paused. I am not asking for anything, Mom. I am not asking to be forgiven. I am giving you back what belonged to you. Wilhelmina took the ring from the velvet. Her hand was shaking. Her knuckles were swollen. She slid the ring onto the ring finger of her left hand beneath her own wedding band. It fit. She had not been sure it would. The arthritis had changed the shape of her fingers in the years since her mother had died. It fit. She looked at her son. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "Come up to the porch, Roland. Loretta is bringing pie at 11. The spring recital was held on the first Saturday in May. Tamsin had her 11 students prepare one composition each, all from Lavinia's catalog. The parlor was set up with folding chairs borrowed from the Methodist Church. The chairs filled every available square foot. People stood along the walls. They stood in the foyer. They stood on the porch with the front door propped open so they could hear. Cyrus's grandmother sat in the front row in a folding chair. Her oxygen tank stood beside her like a small, loyal friend. Loretta sat next to her. Charlotte Pruitt was 3 rows back beside 2 other women who had been at Marbury High School with Lavinia in 1956. They had all driven in for the recital. The youngest of them was 86. Sterling Forsythe stood at the back. Donovan Tice stood beside him. The electrician who had rewired the house had driven down with his wife from Cedar Rapids. The plumber from the Methodist church was there. The piano tuner from the county seat was there sitting in the second row because Tamsin had personally invited him. Dr. Mathilda Rourke sat in the third row. The first volume of the scholarly edition of Lavinia's solo piano works was due to be released by the University of Iowa Press in the autumn. The contracts had been signed in February. Tamsin's annotations were credited as co-editor. Roland stood at the back of the parlor beside Cyrus. He had been coming up to Marbury every other Saturday since the morning he had returned the ring. He had been helping Eldridge in the side yard. He had been sitting with his mother in the kitchen, drinking coffee, saying very little. He had not asked to be forgiven. Wilhelmina had not offered. They had simply begun slowly to sit in the same rooms together. Maxwell was not there. Maxwell was at that moment sitting across from a public defender in a county legal aid office in suburban Chicago, reviewing the documents in the criminal indictment that had been handed down by the Linden County prosecutor in February. The forgery charge was a felony. The fraudulent transfer charge was a felony. The case was being moved to a trial date in the autumn. He would not see the outside of a courtroom for the rest of the year. Annalise Renwick played first. She was 12 years old now. She had been studying for 7 months. She wore a blue dress and her dark hair was pulled back in a single braid. She walked to the upright piano in the parlor and sat down on the bench and adjusted her position the way Wilhelmina had taught her to adjust her position. She set her hands on the keys. Her right hand had 3 working fingers. She played for hands that remember. She played it cleanly. She played it without hesitation. Her 3 working fingers found every note that Lavinia had placed exactly where they could find them. The melody rose from the upright and filled the parlor and went out through the open front door and across the porch and out onto the gravel circle where a few latecomers stood beside their parked cars, holding their hats in their hands, listening. When Annalise finished, she stood up from the bench and bowed slightly and walked back to her chair. The room did not clap right away. Then Cyrus's grandmother started with both hands very slowly. The room followed her. Annalise sat down beside her mother in the second row. Her mother put her arm around her. The girl pressed her face into her mother's shoulder, and her shoulders shook just once, and then she lifted her head and looked at the piano and waited for the next student to begin. 4 more students played. Burton, the retired farmer with the arthritis, played a piece called Slow Light. The school secretary with a tremor played a piece called What the Hands Remember. A 9-year-old boy from down the road, who had been learning for only 6 weeks, played a beginner piece called First Steps. A woman in her late 40s who had lost her ring finger in a kitchen accident 2 years ago and had stopped playing the piano she had loved since childhood, played a piece called Reckoning. Each performance was clean, each was different, each was complete. Tamsin played last. She had been working on Letter to Someone I Haven't Met for 6 months. She had played it for the town the night Maxwell had served her with the petition. She had not played it publicly since. She had been waiting for this room, for this audience, for the right hands to hear what other hands had finally learned. She climbed the spiral staircase into the cupola. The recital by Tamsin's design would end up there. Through the floor opening of the cupola, the sound of the parlor below could rise faintly. She could hear the murmur of the room as people shifted in their chairs and looked up at the staircase opening with confusion, then with understanding. She sat at the small upright on the wooden platform. She opened the manuscript book. She looked once at the note heads, and she did not look at them again. She set her left hand on the keys. Her hand that did not work the way other hands worked. The hand that had been told by 3 different specialists in 3 different cities that it would never play the way it once had. She did not need it to. She played from memory. The chord came first, low and warm. Then the melody, a single line at first, then doubled, then carried in 3 voices at once. The shape of the piece moved through the small octagonal chamber and was caught and amplified by the 8 stained glass walls and the great glass dome above. And the music left the cupola through the 8 open windows and drifted down across the porches and out across the lawn and into the streets of Marbury on a Saturday afternoon in May. Below her in the parlor, 80 people were sitting very still. Their faces were turned upward. They were listening to music coming from above them. Outside in the streets below, people stopped where they were standing. A woman setting a planter on her porch turned her face toward the sound. A man crossing Main Street paused in the middle of the road. The mailman cut his engine and listened with his elbow on the open window. A teenager who had been on his bicycle set the bicycle down on the grass and stood beside it. Two women from the church were holding hands. The boy from across the street was sitting on his porch railing with his face lifted. The sound rolled outward in widening circles the way a stone dropped into water sends rings to the farthest edge of the pond. When Tamsin finished, she stayed at the small piano for a long moment, with her hands resting on the keys. The cupola held the last note. She listened to it fade. She rose. She climbed back down the spiral staircase. In the parlor, people stood up. They did not clap. They stood up. They stood for almost a minute the way people stand at the end of a thing they will not see again in their lives. After the recital, people stayed. They ate pie that Loretta had baked. They drank coffee from the big percolator the church had loaned them. They walked through the house and looked at the photographs on the walls. Cornelius Cresswell in 1885, Theodora at her wedding in 1923, Lavinia at 12, at 15, at 17, the photograph Charlotte Pruitt had given Tamsin in October. They read the framed copy of Theodora's letter in the waiting room. Tamsin stood on the porch for a while. A boy of about 12 came out the front door and ran down the porch steps. He stopped on the gravel walk and looked up at the mansion, at the towers, at the cupola still bright in the late afternoon sun. My mom says this used to be the haunted house. Tamsin looked at the cupola. She could see through the stained glass the silhouette of Wilhelmina at the small upright. She was teaching Annalise a new piece. Annalise's mother was sitting beside them on the platform. The three of them were small figures, distant, framed in stained color. She looked at the lawn. Eldridge was at the side of the yard stacking the last pieces of the demolition lumber. Roland was helping him. The two of them were not speaking. They did not need to. They were just stacking the wood. "It's not haunted," Tamsin said. "It was just waiting." The boy shrugged. He ran off down the gravel road to find his mother. Tamsin stayed on the porch step for a moment longer. Above her, through the open windows of the cupola, the music had started again. Wilhelmina playing this time, showing Annalise what a phrase could sound like in the hands of a teacher who had been waiting 40 years to find the right student. Tamsin closed her eyes and listened. The music had never stopped. It had just been waiting for the right hands to find it, and the hands had found it.